Hey guys, how you doing? So in this chapter we're going to look at biodiversity and its organization. This is chapter 7 in your textbook, and in this session we're going to mainly look at understanding biodiversity overall, and we're also going to have a look at dichotomous keys and how we use dichotomous keys. Okay, so biodiversity, if you look at this map here, this map shows in color the species density of all terrestrial species on the planet. Now, the thing to note here is blue kind of represents low species density, whereas as the colors get brighter into your deep reds, that represents high density. So you can sort of see from this image, if I was to draw a line across the middle within the tropic zone, you can see immediately there that the biodiversity around that particular region, with a few notable exceptions, such as the deserts of Australia, the rest of this region is quite high in biodiversity, and then you can sort of see as you move further away, it becomes a little bit more blue, and as you get towards the poles, it gets a really dark blue. And so we know that biodiversity is highest around the tropic zone because it is very closely linked with primary production. In other words, how well the plants and the primary producers grow in that particular region. And it's also heavily dependent on climate and conditions as well. As we looked at in chapter 8, when conditions are favorable, you tend to get a higher amount of biodiversity. Okay. If I give you the same image of the Earth but give you the marine biodiversity, so that is all of the species in the ocean, then you can actually see a very similar pattern happening. Not quite the same. Once again, the biodiversity is not particular around this particular region here, but in this particular case, it also has a lot to do with ocean currents and the movement of ocean currents. So you can see there the biodiversity is very closely linked to the physical environment and the climate and weather that the organisms are subjected to. Okay? We often think of biodiversity in terms of organisms that we can actually see, but that's actually not always the case. Here is a diagram showing of all the number of species and the different categories that they sort of belong to. You can see here plants. There are currently known roughly about 290,000 different species of plants on the Earth, about 23,000 species of algae, about 280,000 species of animals. Now, this is all other animals, so have been lumped into a category, and you can actually see here pretty much half of the species we've currently identified on the planet are actually insects. So 740,000 species are identified as insects, and they all pretty much occur mainly in the rainforests, which is why rainforests are actually so diverse, because there are actually more insects in the rainforest than anywhere else on the planet. We know about 1,000 different species of viruses or forms of viruses, and about 4,600 different species of bacteria and the like. Yeah. Oh, and about 66,000 species of fungi. Okay, so that kind of shows you all the biodiversity that we can currently identify and see. Now, this is not necessarily conclusive of all of the species present on the planet. Mainly, things like bacteria and other small life forms, like prokaryotes, are too small and too numerous to really count. And you can see later on that they actually occupy a very large proportion of the known diversity on the planet. Okay. Now, how we classify biodiversity? In very simple terms, it's simply the diversity of different organisms. Last time in chapter 8, I talked about species richness versus species abundance, and that's how we sort of measure biodiversity. But to a large degree, biodiversity is broken down into three kind of levels or layers. You start with the species. Yeah, species diversity refers to how many different species there are, right? And then when we talk about biodiversity, you also have to talk about the genetic diversity. That is how much how diverse the genetic information is within the species. And so genetic diversity is more noticeable because it is what is behind a lot of the traits and differences within the species that you often find. Yeah, dogs are a really good example of having a lot of genetic diversity. And it kind of shows because they all look very different, right? And the third level is the ecosystem diversity. So how much diversity there is within a given place, yeah, about the ecosystem, whether or not you get a wide variety or different amounts of habitat, species, and things like that within that single area or environment. Now, biodiversity, as we mentioned before, is very closely linked to physical settings, and the key thing is that because the animals live and interact with each other over time, a lot of changes tend to take place, and so biodiversity actually changes over time. Okay. I want to have a look a little bit about classification because classification sort of takes up the majority of this chapter. And it's actually worth noting that when we talk about classification, it is actually a human endeavor. Yeah, when we classify an animal, when we call an animal a dog or a cat, that's actually what we as humans have decided to call and name that particular animal. And it's a way in which we make sense of the world and the living things that are around us, right? And so when you think about classification, it actually happens, all the time. We classify objects, we classify locations, we classify different environments, and we classify animals. In the Bible, if you actually look at Genesis 1, you can actually see that God himself classifies as well, right? And so it's a way of organizing living things. So account for God's creation in Genesis 1, it talked about God producing the earth within those 6 days. From verse 11 onwards, you can actually see that in verse 11 it says, "Then God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and the trees on the land that bear fruit with seeds in it according to their various kinds." That quote, "to their kind," actually reoccurs many times throughout that particular chapter in Genesis 1 when God creates everything and he kind of labels it to its kind. You can see down there, when he creates the seas, he goes, "So God created the great creatures of the sea and the living things in which the water teemed and that moves about according to its kind." Yeah, every winged bird according to its kind. And then later on when he produces the land, he actually classifies the land as well. He puts them under the category of livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to their kind. And so, one of the side notes that's interesting to sort of think about is actually, the kind of people that the Bible was written to, or particularly the book of Genesis was written to at that time, were shepherds, and people who were farmers and who looked after animals and were familiar with livestock, who were familiar with creatures that move along the ground, and who were familiar with wild animals because they were directly relevant to their lives. Obviously, today we classify things a little bit differently from a scientific point of view, but it's worth noting that classification is something that actually helps us make sense and understand the world better. And who knows, classification might change in the future. Okay, so when we classify things, we classify them based on two things. Yeah, we can either look at them and classify them based on their physical structure or their what we call morphology, their form, or we classify them according to their genetic material. Yeah, how similar they are to one another. And classification biologically is really just arranging them according to similarities, whether it is physical structure similarities or genetic material. Yeah. Okay, so let's see how you guys go. Now, how would you go about grouping these organisms? Yeah, so if you see here, we've got the lion in one picture, the middle one being the cat, and the third one being the cheetah. Yeah, probably the first thought that a lot of you guys would think of would be to all call them as cats. Yeah, because to us, they all belong to the cat family. Yeah, and so that term cat family is actually a scientific term that we use to classify different species of felines. Yeah, and in this case here, this is Panthera leo. This is Felis catus, and actually I don't know what the cheetah is called, so I'm just going to skip it. Right. What about these ones? Yeah, these ones are probably a little bit more difficult to classify. You've got the snail, you've got the ant, and you've got the worm. Right. How would you guys classify these organisms? Yeah, what term would you use to group them together? Right. Some of you guys may know, some of you guys may not know, but the term that we actually use to classify all of them into one group is actually called invertebrates. Yeah, organisms that lack a vertebrae or a spine, and so the mollusk has a shell, the ant has an exoskeleton, and the the worm doesn't have any. It has a hydrostatic skeleton, which is one that is made up of mainly water, okay, and fluids. One of the ways that we classify them, probably the easiest way and the way in which you are most familiar with from your studies in middle school, is using what we call a dichotomous key. We use that as a way of looking at structure, the organism structure, and then making a kind of determination on what the species is based on their similarities. It's called dichotomous because it only has two options, and you go with those options. So, for example, let's say you encounter 4 different birds, and we'll call them W, X, Y, and Z, and we want to identify what those species of birds are. We can use the dichotomous key that scientists have produced and made, and we can work through those options. And so each bird would occupy a space, and then you sort of work your way through the steps. So if we took bird W, for example, you would go to question 1, and you would ask that question. Does the beak is the beak relatively long and slender? If it is part of the Certhidae family. If it is relatively stout and heavy, then you would move to question 2, right? And so you kind of look at that and you kind of think, well, I think that it might be long and slender, right? And so you might go to it might be the Certhidae one, right? If you go to bird X, you might ask the same questions. You start again. Is the beak relatively long and slender, or is it relatively stout and heavy? You might think, well, this one is probably stout and heavy, so we're going to go to question 2. In question 2, does the bottom surface of the lower beak, is it flat and straight, or is the bottom surface of the lower beak curved? Now, the bottom surface of the lower beak is this surface here. Is it flat, or is it curved? And in our case, it is curved, so we are going to go to step 3. And so the lower edge of the upper beak has a distinct bend, or the lower edge of the upper beak is mostly flat. So the lower edge here, the lower edge of the upper beak is here, so it is relatively flat, so it is a platyspiza. And so we've identified bird W, and we've identified bird Z. You can go ahead and probably try and figure out what bird Y and bird Z are. But that is the basis of a dichotomous key. And so when scientists identify organisms, they produce this dichotomous key that they can then bring out into the field and use that to identify any unknown species, whether they belong to a group. Here's another one. You can go ahead and pause the video. So there's a 6-step division here, and this is identifying a marine organism, and this guy here, trying to figure out what on earth he is. Some of you guys may know him, some of you guys may not, but you can go ahead and give that a shot and see how you go, right? Now, if we look at this dichotomous key, we can go through the same process and try and figure out, what category falls under. So we start at decision 1A or 1B. Does it have a hard outer covering or a shell covering all of its body? You would say, well, yeah, it's got 2 shells here, one there and one there. So let's go to step 2. Does it have a single shell, or does it have more than one valve? And so if you look at your organism, you can see that it's got 2 halves of a shell. So we're going to say that it has more than one valve. And we go to step 4. In step 4, both valves convex, in other words, they curve outwards, or are they one flat and one convex? And so in this case here, the top one here doesn't really look like it, but it is actually flat, and the bottom one is the curved one, and so we can make the conclusion that it is a scallop. Now that is just a simple and easy way of going about it. Hopefully you guys also reach the same conclusion. Now, one of the things to note is a dichotomous key is entirely based on physical structures. You really can only look at the physical structures of the organism in order to make a conclusion about that organism. And so, if an organism has particular features or traits that aren't noticeable, or they look the same on the outside but are completely different on the inside, for example, then dichotomous keys can sometimes fall short. and they heavily rely on the fact that we can see and observe the difference between species. Yeah, so for some species it's a little bit harder to make that categorization, and dichotomous keys aren't so useful for that, and particularly if a species is a completely new and undiscovered species, they won't fit into any dichotomous keys, or they can be mistaken for a species that is pre-existing. Yeah, and so you can see that scientists, when they classify animals, they actually have to be really careful with the way they classify, and mistakes have been made in the past because of that. Yeah, so there you go. So that's the dichotomous keys. Next time we're going to look at species and how we actually identify and name different species. All right, I'll see you guys.